What is the true measure of a person's worth? Is it the car they drive, the balance in their bank account, or is it something deeper, something invisible to the naked eye? For Clara, a 24-year-old waitress drowning in debt, the answer would come during a routine Tuesday night shift. It started with a single spilled glass of water and an act of shocking cruelty aimed at a frail old janitor. She had a choice: stay silent and keep her desperately needed job, or speak up and lose everything. She chose to act. What she didn't know was that her choice wouldn't just cost her a job, it would unravel a secret that would shatter the lives of the powerful and change hers forever. The clinking of silverware against fine china was the soundtrack to Clara Hayes's life. It was a symphony of quiet desperation, each chime a reminder of the world she served, but could never afford to join. The Gilded Spoon, a bastion of culinary arrogance in downtown Boston, was where the city's elite came to be seen. They dined on seared foie gras and truffle-infused everything, leaving behind crumbs and condescension in equal measure. For Clara, they left tips that were the difference between making rent and facing an eviction notice. Tonight was a Tuesday, typically a slower evening, but a chill in the early autumn air had driven a respectable crowd indoors. Clara moved with an practiced grace between the linen-draped tables, her smile a carefully constructed mask that hid the gnawing anxiety in her gut. Her mother's medical bills were piling up on her small kitchen table like a mountain of snow, and the latest letter from the hospital's billing department felt heavier than the stack of plates she now balanced on her arm. Mitral valve regurgitation. The words sounded as expensive as they were terrifying. Her one source of quiet comfort during these long shifts was Mr. Peterson. Arthur Peterson, as his name tag read, was the restaurant's janitor. He was a man who seemed to have faded into the background of life, a ghost in a grey uniform. He was stooped with age, his hands gnarled by what Clara guessed was arthritis, and his eyes, a pale, watery blue, held a permanent look of gentle apology, as if he was sorry for taking up space. He moved slowly, methodically, pushing his cart of cleaning supplies, his presence as unobtrusive as the hum of the restaurant's expensive ventilation system. Most of the staff ignored him. The younger waiters and hostesses saw him as part of the fixtures, less a person and more a function. But Clara saw the tremor in his hands when he reached for a fallen napkin, the weariness in the slump of his shoulders at the end of a long night. She made a point to speak to him, to ask him how he was doing, to share a bottle of water with him in the sweltering heat of the kitchen alley during their brief, overlapping breaks. "Tough crowd tonight, mister." "Peterson," she'd said just an hour earlier, leaning against the cool brick wall. He'd offered a small, crinkled smile. "They're all just people, Clara. Some are just louder about it than others." He had a quiet dignity that she admired, a stillness that seemed at odds with the frantic, status-obsessed energy inside. Now, as she cleared table 7, she saw him by the grand oak bar, diligently mopping a small, almost invisible scuff mark on the polished marble floor. He was meticulous in his work, a craftsman of cleanliness. She gave him a discreet nod, and he returned it with that same gentle smile. It was a silent pact of solidarity between two people on the lowest rungs of the ladder, in a place built to celebrate those at the very top. Her focus was broken by the sharp, demanding snap of fingers from table 12, her most challenging assignment of the evening. They were the reason the air in this section of the restaurant was thick with tension. They were Chad and Tiffany Wellington. Chad was a man who looked like he was born into a custom-tailored suit, his hair perfectly coiffed his jaw, set in a permanent state of smug superiority. Tiffany, his wife, was a sculpture of sharp angles and expensive labels, her face a mask of bored disdain. Her Birkin bag, a garish shade of orange, sat on the chair beside her, as if it were a paying customer. They were regulars known for being ruthlessly demanding and miserably poor tippers, but they spent a fortune on vintage wine, so the manager, Mr. Davies, treated them like royalty. Girl Tiffany called out her voice, dripping with impatience, not even bothering to make eye contact. This Pellegrino is insufficiently chilled. Take it back. And the bread basket is looking pathetic. Do something about it. Right away, Ma'am Clara said, her professional smile plastered on. Inside, she was chanting her mantra. For Mum. For the rent. For the bills. She could endure any humiliation for her mother. She picked up the bottle, the condensation barely cool on her skin, and turned to head back to the bar, her jaw tight. That's when the night's symphony hit its first discordant, shattering note. The Wellingtons had been a storm, brewing from the moment they'd swept through the restaurant's heavy glass doors. They hadn't walked in so much as made an entrance, pausing dramatically to allow the hostess to practically trip over herself in her haste to greet them. Chad and Tiffany Wellington. Table 12. As requested, Chad had announced not to the hostess, but to the room at large, his voice projecting an assumption of importance. He scanned the dining room with a proprietary air, as if he were inspecting a property he was considering buying and demolishing. Clara had been assigned their table, a fact that made her stomach clench. She'd served them twice before. The first time they'd sent back a perfectly cooked steak, claiming it was psychologically underdone. The second time, Tiffany had found a microscopic flaw in a wine glass and demanded the entire table setting be replaced, accusing the restaurant of trying to poison her with substandard glassware. Both times her tip had been a single insulting penny left pointedly in the center of the table. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Wellington. My name is Clara, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. She had said, her voice even and polite. Chad had looked her up and down, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second too long, a silent, dismissive appraisal that made her feel like an insect. Just get us a bottle of the 09 Chateau, Margot, and be quick about it. We have a very important call later, he'd ordered, waving her away before she could even offer them water. The very important call was the centerpiece of their conversation. They spoke about it in voices that were deliberately loud, ensuring the surrounding tables were privy to their supposed significance. Jonathan from Vance Enterprises confirmed the meeting for Thursday. Chad said, scrolling aggressively through his phone. This is it, Tiff. The Kensington project. If we land this, we're not just set. We're legendary. Tiffany preened, taking a delicate sip of the outrageously expensive wine Clara had carefully decanted for them. Arthur Vance himself is going to be reviewing the final proposals. They say he's ruthless, an old-school titan. He can make or break you with a single word. He's a ghost. Chad scoffed, though a flicker of nervousness crossed his face. No one's seen him in public for years, but his money is very, very real. And I'm going to get it. He values, what was the word Jonathan used? Unyielding excellence. He despises mediocrity. Chad said the word mediocrity while looking directly at Clara as she refilled his water glass. The entire meal was a performance of their own perceived superiority. They complained about the ambient lighting. They critiqued the seasoning of their appetizers with the gravity of world leaders discussing foreign policy. And through it all, they treated Clara not as a human being, but as an automaton, an inconvenient necessity in the process of getting food from the kitchen to their mouths. Clara moved on autopilot, her mind a whirlwind of calculations. The electric bill is due Friday. The pharmacy copay was $70. Mum's follow-up appointment. Each condescending remark from the Wellingtons was another weight added to her shoulders, but she bore it with the stoicism of someone who had no other choice. Meanwhile, Mr. Peterson went about his duties. He refilled the soap dispenser in the restrooms, polished the brass railings near the entrance, and collected the trash bags from the kitchen. He was a shadow moving along the periphery of the Wellingtons' glittering world. At one point, he had to sweep up a small piece of a broken cracker near their table. Tiffany had watched him, her nose wrinkled in disgust. Ugh, she'd muttered to Chad, loud enough for both Mr. Peterson and Clara to hear. Can you imagine ending up like that, utterly invisible? A failure. Mr. Peterson hadn't reacted, his face remaining a stoic, placid mask, but Clara saw his hand, the one holding the dustpan, tighten for a brief second. She felt a hot spike of anger in her chest, a fierce protective instinct for the gentle old man. But she swallowed it down, reminding herself of the mountain of bills. Her anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. The storm had been brewing all night, feeding on arrogance and casual cruelty. Now, with the complaint about the insufficiently chilled Pellegrino, the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. The universe has a strange and often cruel sense of timing. As Clara turned from table 12, the lukewarm bottle of Pellegrino in her hand, her path intersected with Mr. Peterson's. He was backing away from the bar, having just finished his mopping his movements, slow and careful. At the same moment, a busboy rushing with a heavy tub of dirty dishes jostled past Clara. It was a chain reaction of minor, insignificant events that would culminate in disaster. The busboy's elbow clipped Clara's arm. She stumbled, trying to regain her balance, and in doing so, bumped directly into the stooped figure of Mr. Peterson. The old janitor, frail and caught off guard, staggered backward. His worn, rubber-soled shoe slipped on the very spot he had just mopped a patch of marble, still slick with a faint sheen of moisture. Time seemed to slow down. Clara watched in horror as his arms pinwheeled through the air. The mop and bucket he was pulling clattered to the ground. Mr. Peterson himself fell not hard, but awkwardly, landing with a soft grunt against the base of the Wellingtons' table. The impact was just enough to send a tremor through the heavy wood. On the table's edge, precariously close to Tiffany, Wellington sat a tall, slender glass of ice water. It wobbled for a terrifying second before tipping over, sending a cascade of ice-cold water directly into the lap of Tiffany's pristine, cream-colored silk dress. A deafening silence fell over the section. The murmur of conversations ceased. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Every eye turned to table 12. Tiffany Wellington let out a piercing shriek, a sound of pure, unadulterated outrage. She leaped to her feet, staring down at the dark, spreading stain on her dress as if she'd been doused with acid. "Oh my God, look what you've done!" she screamed, her voice cracking with fury. Her rage, however, was not directed at the busboy or at Clara. It was aimed like a laser at the frail old man struggling to get up from the floor. Mr. Peterson, his face pale with shock and embarrassment, pushed himself onto his hands and knees. "I am so sorry, Ma'am. It was an accident. I slipped." Chad Wellington was on his feet in an instant, his face a mask of purple fury. He loomed over Mr. Peterson, his expensive suit jacket bunched at his shoulders. An accident. An accident. "You clumsy, incompetent old fool. This is a designer dress. It costs more than you make in a year. I'm truly sorry." Mr. Peterson stammered, his voice trembling. He managed to get to one knee, looking up at the furious couple with his watery, terrified eyes. The manager, Mr. Davies, was already scurrying over his face, a mess of perspiration and panicked appeasement. "Mr. and Mrs. Wellington, my deepest apologies. Is there anything I can do?" "You can start by getting this filth out of my sight." Tiffany shrieked, pointing a perfectly manicured, trembling finger at Mr. Peterson. "He shouldn't even be allowed to be out here with the customers. He's a walking hazard, a disgusting, pathetic old man." The words hung in the air, sharp and venomous. Disgusting. Pathetic. They were daggers aimed at a man who was already on his knees. Clara felt every single one of them land. She saw Mr. Peterson flinch his shoulders, slumping as if under a physical blow. The quiet dignity she had always admired in him seemed to crumble, replaced by a raw, naked humiliation that was painful to witness. Mr. Davies, ever the spineless sycophant, immediately turned on the janitor. "Peterson, what the hell do you think you're doing? Get up! Go to the back, now." But Chad wasn't finished. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing snarl. "No, wait. Before he goes, he's going to clean it up. On his knees. The way he should." He looked around the room, a cruel smirk playing on his lips, enjoying the audience. "My wife's shoes are wet. Lick them clean, old man." A collective gasp went through the nearby tables. The suggestion was so vile, so far beyond the pale, that it stunned the room into a deeper silence. It was no longer about a spilled drink. It was a public execution of a man's dignity. Mr. Peterson stared up at him, his face ashen. He was frozen, a statue of shame and disbelief. And that was when something inside Clara Hayes snapped. The mountain of bills, the fear of eviction, the desperate need for this job, it all vanished, burned away by a white-hot, righteous fire. Clara moved before she even consciously decided to. She placed herself directly between the towering figure of Chad Wellington and the kneeling form of Mr. Peterson. She was smaller, slighter, but she stood as if she were a shield forged of steel. "That's enough," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the tense silence with the clarity of a bell. Chad looked at her first in confusion, then in utter disbelief. "Excuse me, what did you just say to me?" "I said that's enough." Clara repeated her gaze, unflinching. She looked from his furious face to Tiffany's sneering one. It was an accident, a complete accident. "And you will not speak to him that way?" Tiffany let out a laugh that sounded like shattering glass. "Oh, this is rich. The little waitress is defending the decrepit janitor." "Do you have any idea who we are?" "I know you're the people at table 12, Clara replied, her voice dangerously calm. "And right now you're human beings, publicly humiliating another human being for a mistake. And it's going to stop. Right now." She then turned and knelt beside Mr. Peterson, placing a gentle hand on his trembling arm. "Mr. Peterson, are you all right? Let me help you up." The old man looked at her, his eyes swimming with a mixture of shame and a flicker of profound gratitude. He allowed her to help him to his feet, his joints creaking in protest. He leaned on her for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of her incredible act of courage. Mr. Davies, seeing his 5-star evening devolve into a full-blown crisis, rushed forward and grabbed Clara's arm. "Clara, what in God's name do you think you're doing? Apologize to Mr. and Mrs. Wellington. This instant I will not," Clara said, pulling her arm free. She turned to face her boss, her chin held high. "I will not apologize for defending a good man from this verbal abuse. What they said was disgusting. What they asked him to do was monstrous. If you think their dinner bill is more important than a person's dignity, then that's on you, Mr. Davies. But I won't be a part of it." The restaurant was now a theatre, and they were all on stage. The other diners were watching, rapt. Some looked uncomfortable, others impressed. A few of the other waiters hovered in the background, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and admiration for Clara's audacity. Chad Wellington's face had gone from red to a pale, clammy white. He was being challenged, publicly, by a waitress. It was an affront to his entire existence. "Davies," he snarled, his voice low and shaking with rage. "Control your employee, or I will not only never dine in this overpriced establishment again, I will make it my personal mission to see that your reputation is dragged through every gutter in this city. I will write reviews that will make your chefs weep. I will call the health inspector. I will ruin you." The threat was clear. Mr. Davies's face crumpled. He saw his career, his meticulously managed restaurant, his very livelihood flashing before his eyes. And he made his choice. He turned to Clara, his expression cold and hard. "Clara Hayes, you are fired. Get your things and get out. Now." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Fired. The one word she had been dreading for months. Her mother's face flashed in her mind. The bills, the eviction notice. A wave of panic and nausea washed over her. For a split second, she thought about begging, about apologizing, about doing whatever it took to take it all back. She looked at Mr. Peterson, who was standing beside her, his face a canvas of utter despair, not for himself but for her. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, but no words came out. Then she looked back at the triumphant, smirking faces of Chad and Tiffany Wellington, and in that moment the panic subsided, replaced by a profound, unshakable certainty. She had done the right thing. It had cost her everything, but she had done the right thing. "Fine," she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her. She began to untie the strings of her apron. "I'd rather be unemployed and able to look at myself in the mirror than work one more second in a place that allows this kind of cruelty." She folded her apron neatly and placed it on a nearby service stand. She gave Mr. Peterson one last reassuring look. Then, with her head held high, she turned to walk out of the restaurant and away from her job, her future, a terrifying, uncertain blank. She didn't get more than 2 steps. A voice, quiet yet filled with an astonishing and unfamiliar authority, spoke from behind her. "Nobody is firing her." Clara stopped dead. Everyone turned. The voice hadn't come from Mr. Davies. It hadn't come from another customer. It had come from Mr. Peterson. The change was instantaneous and utterly baffling. The man who stood there was no longer the stooped, apologetic janitor. Arthur Peterson, or the man they thought was him, straightened his back. The gesture seemed to add inches to his height. The weary, apologetic slump in his shoulders vanished, replaced by a posture of immense power and confidence. He lifted his head, and the watery, pale blue eyes were suddenly sharp, clear, and blazing with an intelligence that was nothing short of intimidating. The tremor in his hands was gone. He looked at Mr. Davies, and for the first time, the manager seemed to truly see the man in the janitor's uniform. He saw him not as a fixture, but as a force. I said the man repeated his voice, now a calm, resonant baritone that carried effortlessly through the silent room. "Nobody is firing her." Chad Wellington let out a contemptuous laugh. "And who the hell are you to say anything, the head of the janitors' union?" "Get out of here before I have you arrested for harassment." The old man ignored Chad completely, as if he were a buzzing fly. His piercing gaze remained locked on Mr. Davies. He reached into the pocket of his grey uniform trousers, his movements now fluid and precise. He didn't pull out a wallet. He pulled out a sleek, modern smartphone that seemed utterly at odds with his attire. With a few deft taps of his thumb, he placed a call. He put the phone to his ear. "Jonathan," he said, his voice pure command. "Yes, it's me. I'm at the Gilded Spoon." A pause. "The Wellington proposal for the Kensington project. Is it on my desk?" Another brief pause. "Good. I want you to take that proposal, walk it over to the industrial shredder in the sub-level, and personally watch it turn into confetti. Then I want you to call Chad Wellington's office and inform them that Vance Enterprises has blacklisted their firm effective immediately. We will not be doing business with them now or ever. Is that understood? Chad's face went through a rapid theatrical series of transformations, from arrogance to confusion to dawning comprehension, and finally to sheer blood-draining horror. His jaw hung open. The name, Vance Enterprises, the project, Kensington, the ruthlessness, the phone call. No, Tiffany whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. It can't be. The man ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He then turned his laser-like focus onto the petrified couple. He took a step towards them, and they both instinctively recoiled. You were right about one thing, Mr. Wellington, he said, his voice laced with ice. Arthur Vance is indeed ruthless. He despises mediocrity. But what he despises even more, he leaned in slightly, is arrogance, cruelty, and the pathetic spectacle of people who mistake wealth for worth. You wanted to impress Arthur Vance. Congratulations, you've made quite the impression. He let the words hang in the air for a moment before turning his attention to the manager, who now looked as if he was about to have a heart attack. Mr. Davies was staring at him, his face the color of spoiled milk, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Mr. Davies Arthur Vance said calmly, "An interesting management philosophy you have here. Prioritize the bullies, discard the principled. I've been working here for 3 weeks. I've watched you ignore safety violations in the kitchen. I've heard you mock your employees behind their backs. And tonight I've seen you sacrifice a good person's livelihood to appease the wallet of a tyrant. This restaurant has potential, a good location, a decent chef. But it lacks a soul. It lacks character. And it starts at the top." He paused, letting the manager tremble. Let's see. He glanced at a surprisingly elegant slim watch on his wrist, a Patek Philippe that no janitor could ever afford. As of about 5 minutes ago, my family office completed the purchase of the holding company that owns this restaurant. So allow me to introduce myself properly. I am Arthur Vance. And you, Mr. Davies, are fired. If the room had been silent before, it was now a vacuum. The air had been sucked out of it. The only sound was the faint, horrified gasp from Tiffany Wellington as the full catastrophic reality of the situation crashed down upon her. She and her husband had just humiliated, berated, and insulted their golden goose, their 1 in a million shot at the big leagues. They had told the ghost, the Titan himself, Arthur Vance, to lick their shoes. Amid the wreckage of 3 careers, Arthur Vance turned to the one person who wasn't cowering. He looked at Clara, who was standing, frozen her mind, struggling to process the impossible scene unfolding before her. Her apron was still clutched in her hand, a useless relic from a life that had ceased to exist 10 minutes ago. His eyes softened, the icy fire replaced by a genuine, profound warmth. "Clara Hayes," he said, his voice gentle now. "May I have a word with you?" Clara could only nod her throat, too tight to form words. The entire dining room seemed to be holding its collective breath, watching the final act of this surreal play. Arthur Vance gestured toward an empty, secluded corner table, one usually reserved for the most VIP of guests. He pulled out a chair for her, with a grace that was entirely natural, a gesture of old-world chivalry that stood in stark contrast to his janitor's uniform. She sat down numbly, feeling like she was in a dream. Arthur sat opposite her, the grey uniform suddenly looking like a disguise in a Shakespearean comedy rather than the clothes of a poor man. The other diners began to whisper furiously, but one sharp glance from Arthur silenced the room once more. He gave his full attention to Clara. "I owe you an explanation," he began, his voice low and sincere, "and an apology. I put you in an impossible position tonight, and I am deeply sorry for that. You're Arthur." "Vance." Clara finally managed to whisper the name, feeling foreign and monumental on her tongue. He smiled a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. "In the flesh. For the past 6 years, since my wife Eleanor passed away, I've been adrift. Vance Enterprises runs itself for the most part. The money just accumulates. It felt meaningless. Eleanor always said that money is just a tool, and it's useless unless you use it to build something good. So I decided to start a foundation in her name, the Eleanor Vance Foundation." He paused, a flicker of deep emotion in his eyes. "But a foundation is just a building and a bank account without the right people. People with integrity, with compassion. People who do the right thing, not when it's easy, but when it's hard. When it costs them something. I grew tired of the sycophants in my boardroom, the yes men who would agree with anything I said. I wanted to find someone real. So I started doing this." He gestured to his uniform, working in my own companies and in others. As a janitor, a mailroom clerk, a dishwasher, I wanted to see how people really behave when they think no one of importance is watching. Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. The quiet, gentle Mr. Peterson was one of the wealthiest men in the country, searching for decency in a world of greed. "For 3 weeks I've watched you," Arthur continued. "I saw you give half your sandwich to one of the homeless men who sleeps in the alley. I saw you stay late off the clock to help a new waitress who was overwhelmed. And tonight I saw you sacrifice your job, which I know you desperately need, to defend a man you believed to be a powerless, penniless old janitor. You didn't do it for a reward. You did it because it was right. That Clara is a character that cannot be bought. It is the rarest and most valuable commodity in the world." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "I didn't just find a person of character tonight. I think I found the heart of my foundation." Clara's heart was hammering against her ribs. I don't understand." "I'm offering you a job, Miss Hayes," he said, formally, though his tone was anything but. "Not as a waitress. I want you to come work for me at the Eleanor Vance Foundation. I'm not talking about an entry-level position. I'm offering you the role of Director of Community Outreach. You would be responsible for identifying individuals and grassroots organizations that need our help. You would be my eyes and ears on the ground. Your first task would be to manage a $5 million discretionary fund for immediate aid to families in crisis." Clara's jaw dropped. $5 million. Director, the words didn't compute. "But I don't have a degree in whatever you need for that. I'm a waitress. I have no experience. You have more experience than any Ivy League graduate with a master's in non-profit management," Arthur countered firmly. "You have lived experience. You have empathy. You have courage. And you have unimpeachable integrity. Those are the only qualifications I care about. We will provide any training you need. As for salary, let's start at $200,000 a year, plus full benefits. Your mother's medical care," he added gently. "Seeing the tears welling in her eyes will be handled. Consider it done. The best doctors, the best treatments. It's taken care of." Tears were now streaming freely down Clara's face. She thought of her mother, of the stack of bills, of the constant crushing weight of poverty. It was as if a mountain had been lifted from her soul. In the background, the fallout continued. Chad and Tiffany Wellington were being discreetly but firmly escorted out by restaurant security, their faces pale masks of ruin. Mr. Davies was pleading with a stone-faced man in a suit who had appeared as if from nowhere, Jonathan from the phone call to no avail. But Clara barely noticed. Her world had shrunk to this table, to this incredible life-altering offer from the man she had known as Mr. Peterson. Why she finally choked out. Why me, Arthur Vance, reached across the table and patted her hand gently, his touch warm and paternal. Because my wife Eleanor was a lot like you. She came from nothing. She worked 2 jobs to support her family, and she never ever lost her kindness. Seeing you stand up for me tonight, it was like seeing a spark of her again. You're not just the heart of the foundation, Clara. You're its soul. 6 months felt like a lifetime. Or perhaps more accurately, it was the beginning of a life Clara Hayes had never dared to imagine for herself. The constant grinding anxiety that had been her shadow for years, a hum of panic about rent bills and the fragility of her mother's health, had receded. In its place was a quiet sense of purpose that settled deep in her bones, as solid and reassuring as the antique oak desk her hands now rested upon. Her mornings no longer began with the jarring blare of an alarm set for a 5:00 a.m. commute to a job that chipped away at her soul. Instead, she woke with the gentle Boston sunlight filtering through the large bay window of her new apartment in Brookline. It was a modest 2-bedroom, but to Clara it was a palace. It smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings, and most importantly, the 2nd bedroom belonged to her mother. Every morning, she'd make them both tea, and they would sit on the small balcony overlooking a tree-lined street. Her mother, Catherine, was a different woman. The grey-paned pallor was gone, replaced by a healthy pink in her cheeks. The world-class cardiac team at Mass General, arranged by Arthur, had worked what felt like a miracle. Her new medication regimen was working, and the fear that had haunted both their lives had been replaced by conversations about the future, about joining a book club, planting a garden, perhaps even taking a trip to see the ocean in Maine. Heading off to build your empire, Catherine would ask with a playful smile as Clara gathered her things for work. Clara would laugh. "Just laying a few bricks, Mum." The headquarters of the Eleanor Vance Foundation was not a sterile, modern skyscraper of glass and steel. Arthur had chosen a historic brownstone on Beacon Hill, a building with character and history etched into its very foundations. The inside was a sanctuary of quiet dignity, with towering bookshelves, worn leather armchairs, and the scent of old paper and lemon polish. It felt less like a corporate office, and more like the world's most compassionate library. Clara's title was Director of Community Outreach, but her role was far more profound. She was the foundation's heart, its hands, and its conscience. Arthur had been true to his word. He had given her autonomy, trust, and a staggering amount of resources, but most importantly, he had given her his time. He was her mentor, her guide, and in many ways the father figure she'd never had. Her first month had been a whirlwind of learning crash courses in non-profit finance, grant allocation, and social work ethics, all taught by private tutors Arthur had hired. But her true education happened outside the office. It happened in the cramped living rooms of struggling families, in the echoing halls of underfunded community centers, and in the quiet waiting rooms of free clinics. Today, her focus was on a folder that lay open on her desk. The cover sheet read, Garcia, Marco, and Eleanor. She had read their story 3 times, and each time it felt like a punch to the gut. Marco Garcia was a non-union construction worker, a man who had spent 2 decades building the city's high-rises. 6 weeks ago, a scaffolding collapse at an unregulated site had left him with 2 shattered vertebrae and a permanent disability. With no insurance and a neglectful employer who claimed he was an independent contractor, The family had been plunged into a free fall. Their savings were gone. Eviction was imminent. Their daughter, a brilliant 14-year-old named Sophia, was on the verge of dropping out of her advanced placement high school program to work at a fast food restaurant. This file was a perfect storm of systemic failure, bad luck, and quiet desperation. It was the kind of story that would have once made Clara feel a sense of hopeless, powerless rage. Now it sparked a different feeling, a focused determination. Instead of just calling them, Clara had scheduled a home visit. She believed you couldn't understand the architecture of a problem without walking through its rooms. She drove her modest but reliable foundation-leased sedan to Dorchester, a world away from the manicured lawns of Brookline. The Garcias lived on the 3rd floor of a tired triple-decker apartment building. She knocked gently. The door was opened by a woman with exhaustion etched into the fine lines around her eyes, but with a fierce protective pride in her bearing. This was Elena Garcia. "Miss Hayes," she asked, her voice wary. "Please call me Clara," she said with a warm, disarming smile. "Thank you for letting me come." The apartment was small and meticulously clean, though the furniture was worn and the walls were bare except for a simple crucifix and a series of framed, hand-drawn pictures of remarkable quality Sophia's artwork. In the corner of the living room, propped up with pillows on a sagging couch, was Marco. His face was tight with pain, but he nodded a greeting. Sophia was at the kitchen table pretending to do homework, but watching Clara with intelligent, skeptical eyes. Clara didn't come in with a clipboard and a list of questions. She came in with a bag of groceries she'd picked up. On the way, good coffee, fresh bred fruit, and sat at the kitchen table with them. She didn't talk about the foundation at first. She asked about them. She asked Marco about his work, about the buildings he was proudest of. She asked Elena about her job as a part-time cleaner at a downtown hotel. She complimented Sophia's drawings, and the girl's guarded expression softened almost imperceptibly. For an hour, she just listened. She heard the story behind the paperwork, the terror of the accident, the bureaucratic nightmares of trying to get assistance, the shame of having to ask for help, and the overwhelming fear of what would happen to their daughter. Sophia. "She's the smart one," Marco said, his voice thick with a mixture of pride and pain. "She's supposed to be the one who gets out. Goes to college. Not this." Finally, after earning their trust, Clara opened her own folder. "Okay," she said gently. "I'm here because the Eleanor Vance Foundation wants to help. And I don't just mean with a check for this month's rent. We want to help build a bridge for your family to get to the other side of this." She laid it out for them, her voice calm and clear. First, the foundation would pay their rent in full for the next 12 months, giving them a year of stability to get back on their feet. Second, they would cover the full cost of Marco's physical therapy and connect him with a top orthopedic surgeon for a second opinion, all at no cost to them. Third, they would hire a lawyer to sue the construction company for negligence and fight for the disability payments he was rightfully owed. Fourth, they would connect Elena with a partner organization that provided job training and placement, helping her find a full-time position with benefits. She saved the last part for Sophia. She turned to the teenager, whose eyes were now wide with disbelief. And Sophia Clara said, "I looked up your school records. Your grades are phenomenal. Your art is incredible. We've spoken to the admissions head at the Boston Arts Academy, and they've agreed to grant you a full scholarship starting immediately contingent on a portfolio review. The foundation will provide you with all the art supplies you need, a new laptop, and a tutor to ensure you don't fall behind during the transition. Your only job is to be a brilliant 14-year-old. Silence. Elena's hand was over her mouth, and tears were streaming down her face. Marco was openly weeping, a man broken not by his injury, but by the sudden overwhelming force of grace. Sophia just stared at Clara, her skepticism shattered and replaced by a look of dawning, world-altering hope. Why Sophia whispered the one-word question containing a universe of doubt. "Why would you do all this for us?" Clara looked at the family, at the crucifix on the wall, at the daughter's beautiful drawings. She thought of her own mother, of the terror she'd felt facing that mountain of bills. Because my old boss had a saying, Clara said, a soft smile on her lips. "Money is just a tool. It's useless unless you use it to build something good." We think your family is something good to build on. Later that afternoon, back in the quiet sanctuary of the foundation, Clara sat across from Arthur Vance in his office. A fire crackled in the hearth, warding off the late autumn chill. She had just finished telling him about her visit with the Garcias. Arthur listened intently, his chin resting on his steepled fingers. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. Eleanor would have loved that he said, his voice soft. She grew up in a place like that. She knew what it was like to watch her parents choose between medicine and food. She used to say that poverty doesn't just steal your future, it steals your imagination. You can't dream when you're terrified. What you did today, Clara, you gave that family back their ability to dream. "You gave me the tools to do it," she replied earnestly. "I still can't believe this is my life. Nonsense. You earned this life that night at the restaurant," he said firmly. "Which brings me to something else. I received a letter last week from Chad Wellington." Clara sat up, surprised. "Really? What did it say?" "The predictable." I'm afraid Arthur sighed, a look of weary disappointment on his face. It was a 12-page grovelling apology. Not for how he treated me, you understand, but for the grievous professional miscalculation of not recognizing me. He detailed the complete collapse of his firm, the loss of his home, his reputation. He was essentially begging for a second chance, for a way back into the world he'd been ejected from. "What are you going to do?" Clara asked. "I shredded it," Arthur said simply. "Not out of spite, Clara, but because the letter proved he still doesn't understand. He's not sorry for being cruel. He's sorry for being cruel to the wrong person. There's a world of difference. His soul is a house built on a rotten foundation. I can't fix that. I can only make sure he doesn't build on my property." He looked at her, his expression serious. "The world is full of Wellingtons and Davieses, people who are perpetually assessing the value of others to determine how they should be treated. That is the great sickness. What you have, what Eleanor had, is the cure. You operate from a fixed principle. Everyone has value, period. That is why you are sitting here, and they are not." The conversation lingered with her as she left the office that evening. The sun was setting, painting the Boston sky in hues of orange and purple. She decided to walk a few blocks before heading home. As she turned a corner, she saw a man sweeping the sidewalk in front of a closed bakery. He was old-stooped and moved with a weariness that was all too familiar. A year ago, she would have seen him and felt a pang of kinship, a shared struggle. She would have given him a sad, knowing smile and continued on her way, her own burdens too heavy to offer much more. But tonight was different. She saw him not just as a symbol of struggle, but as a person with a story, a collection of needs, hopes, and heartbreaks. Just like the Garcias. She walked into a nearby coffee shop, bought 2 steaming cups of coffee and 2 thick slices of banana bread. She went back and approached the man. "Excuse me," she said gently. "Looks like a cold evening to be working. I thought you might like this." The man looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He was younger than she'd thought, but life had clearly taken its toll. "For me, miss, you don't have to do that." "I want to," she said, handing him the coffee and pastry. "My name's Clara." "Frank," he said, taking the cup, his calloused fingers wrapping around its warmth. "Thank you. Thank you very much." They stood there for a moment in the fading light. Instead of walking away, Clara lingered. "Is there a shelter nearby, Frank?" "A warm place to go when you're done." Frank shook his head, looking at his worn-out shoes. "Most are full. I'll probably just find a spot." Clara pulled a card from her purse. It was her card. The Eleanor Vance Foundation. "Frank," she said, her voice full of a quiet authority that was now second nature. "On the back of this card, I'm going to write the address of a transitional housing center we work with. I'm going to call them right now and tell them you're coming. They'll have a warm bed and a hot meal for you. And tomorrow, if you're interested, they have counselors who can help with job placement." Frank stared at the card, then at her. His expression a mixture of profound shock and dawning wonder. He saw the elegant card, the official title, and the kind, earnest face of the woman offering it. Are you an angel?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Clara smiled, a true radiant smile that came from the very core of her being. She thought of Mr. Peterson, the janitor. She thought of Arthur Vance, the billionaire. She thought of her mother, safe and healthy. She thought of the Garcias, their dreams rekindled. "No, Frank," she said, her voice soft but sure. "I'm not an angel. I'm just the construction crew." Clara's story is a powerful reminder that our true character isn't defined by our circumstances, but by our choices. In a world that often measures worth by wealth and status, she showed that compassion is a form of currency that never loses its value. She defended a janitor, and in doing so, discovered a billionaire. But more importantly, she discovered her own strength. This story isn't just about a hidden identity. It's about the hidden power within all of us to effect incredible change through a single act of kindness. It reminds us that you never know who you're talking to, so it's best to treat everyone with dignity. Because the person you help today could be the one who changes your world tomorrow. If this story moved you, and you believe in the power of kindness, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that good deeds never go unnoticed. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that inspire, uplift, and celebrate the very best of the human heart. Thank you for listening.